Okay, so this is the Bible study for Exodus chapter 12, verse 31 through Exodus chapter 13, verse 22. It says, During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me. I don't know, that's my mom would have said, ask nicely. Um, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides the women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, These are the regulations of the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it. Any slave you have bought may eat it after you have circumcised them. But a temporary resident or hired worker may not eat it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised, and he may take a part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. All the Israelites did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. The Lord said to Moses, Consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal. Then Moses said to the people, Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today in the month of Aviv you are leaving. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, Jebusites, the land he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast, and on the seventh day, hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me. I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that this law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time of year after year. After the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you as he promised on oath to you and your ancestors, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In days to come, when your son asks you, What does this mean? Say to him, With a mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When the Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb, and redeem each of you, each of my firstborn sons. And it will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt by his mighty hand. All right. I think I said verse 22, but we're stopping there at verse 16. And we're going to carry on with the rest the next week. Number one, what happened in our last Bible study in Exodus 12, 1 through 30. A, God institutes the Passover. B, God tells Israel how they would commemorate this deliverance from now on. C, God is finally bringing about the deliverance that he has promised. So all of that is true, and some of that is still happening in chapter 12. So in the continuation of chapter 12 and in chapter 13. So we actually find what seems like kind of a repetition or a back and forth between this is what's going on the day that they're delivered, this is how they're to commemorate it. Now I want you to do this and I'll deliver you, and then you're going to commemorate it. And it seems like there's repetition because there's going back and forth. Um, but so sometimes it's a little confusing to read it. Now, is he talking this time about the original day the Passover happened, or is he talking about the commemoration now? And so it's kind of hard to follow sometimes. But that's what happened last week. That's what's still in the process of happening, is God's talking to them about this, and he's actually delivering them. Number two, what happens in 12, 31, and 32? So Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go, and also bless me. And so he wants them out of there. He's driving them out, in fact, as God said. He's at the end of what he's willing to put up with in terms of these plagues. Finally, this was the last straw. Number three, what do we learn in 12:33 through 36? A, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. Wait, isn't that what God promised would happen? It is. They'll drive you out. They're asking them to leave. They're chasing them out. B, the Egyptians were afraid that more people would die if the Israelites didn't leave quickly. So now they've realized we should have listened a long time ago. Now God has done this terrible thing to us, and we don't want any more people to die. See, the Israelites asked for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, like Moses told them. That happened there. D, the Egyptians gave them what they asked for, and Israel plundered the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were willing. So here, Israel leaves the country with all their valuables, and they were happy about it. They gave them to them. Just get out. Number four, what do we learn in 1237 through 42? A, there were about 600,000 men plus women and children and livestock who left Egypt. I don't think normally when we imagine this scene or the flannel graph showed us when we were a kid, that we in our minds see 600,000 men plus women and children and livestock. So if we took every person in the city of Albuquerque, I think the city of Albuquerque is less than 600,000 people. I think it's 500 and something. If you add, and that's if you had the city of Albuquerque and they were all men, and then they had their women and children. So women and children, assume all the men were married, and assume that they all had, even by today's standards, what would be normal, like 2 kids, which probably back then they had quite a few more. But even if it was just two kids and everybody was married, I feel like that's a conservative estimate. Um, so then you're talking about 1.2 million with just with the wives, and then double that. So about 2.5 million people is just a rough estimate, just here on the spot, the way I've described it to you. And if some people had way more children, um, then it could have been more, and their livestock, enough animals to feed 2.5 million people. So you're talking about a city the size of basically the entire state of New Mexico plus El Paso, our Nazarene district. If you had every person that lived in our entire borders, it would be less people than were there that day, who are now going to leave and go out into the desert. So that is a lot of people. And now you understand why Egypt didn't want to lose their workforce, because that is a lot of people. And so all the pictures really don't do justice that we've seen illustrating this. B, they used the dough without yeast to prepare food for themselves. They did that while they were leaving or while they were out there. And C, the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. See also Genesis 15, 12 through 16. So that text is where that is basically prophesied or told, that they would be in a land that was not their own for 400 years. And so it's significant. That's why it's mentioned. Otherwise, why would it matter how many years? But it's because God told them that this was going to happen, and they were released in this, in the time that God said. Number 5, what is the significance of the restrictions that were given in 1243 through 50? So um, they are told that no foreigner can eat the Passover meal, and there's restrictions about who can eat it. And A says, "Wait, I thought this wasn't about nationality. Why didn't God let foreigners eat?" And so it can seem, I think, particularly when we look at it from our modern context, where we're looking for racism in everything, it can seem like this is a racist thing. Why didn't he want anybody eating who was not an Israelite? No foreigners eating. That doesn't seem right. But B says foreigners could eat the Passover meal. So if you read, it says they could, if they had marked their inclusion into covenant relationship with the Lord with the covenant of circumcision, another act of obedience that showed they feared the word of the Lord and were willing to obey him and receive the promised protection that God could bring. So, in other words, all the slaves and all the foreigners living among them were able to eat the Passover meal if they were circumcised, and they had to have all the males in their family circumcised, which was a sign that they um, that they were in covenant relationship with God, that they had accepted that covenant, and they showed it by their step of obedience. And in a lot of ways, it would be like not letting someone take communion unless they have been baptized. This is a meal that we eat together, and it's celebrating God's deliverance, and it's recognizing what God has done for us. But if we don't have that mark of the covenant, if we haven't willingly entered into covenant relationship with God, with the sign of the covenant, then we shouldn't be partaking. And so um, that's kind of, I know different denominations take a different stance on that, and we're a little freer with who we allow to take communion. You don't have to be a member of the Church of the Nazarene, but you are supposed to be a member of the Church of God. And one of the ways that we signify that we are is in baptism. And so this is not unreasonable, and this is not racist because it is not outlawing people who are foreigners from participating. It's only simply trying to ensure that they choose covenant relationship with God. The people of Israel had chosen that covenant as a nation, and others outside had not, but they were welcome to. Number 6, what does the Lord say to Moses in 13:1? The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal. So consecrate or set aside for my purposes every firstborn. So this is what God is asking for. And this is kind of going to shift the Bible study to talk specifically about their response to God's salvation, their act of worship to God in response to God's salvation. So they were Moses was being commanded to set aside the firstborn of every womb, both human and animal, for God. The firstborn belongs to God. Now, what does that mean? Well, we learn about that as we go here. So it says, what does God tell Israel to do in 13:11 through 16? It says, A, give over their firstborn to God. B, the firstborn was saved by God in the Passover. Therefore, the firstborn belonged to God who had saved them from death. They would not be there if it weren't for God. And so this is very much like what happened um, when Samuel's mother um, asked for him, and then when she was given him, she gave him back to God. This idea that if we would not be here were it not for God, then we belong to God. Um, if you've ever watched, I forget which one. It seems like it was Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Um, when Robin saves the guy's life, and then he says basically, I'm dedicated to you, I'm yours, I'm my life belongs to you. Because he had saved his life, he recognized that I wouldn't have a life if it weren't for you, so everything that I still have is because of you, therefore I owe it to you. That's the only way. I can never repay that debt other than to give myself to you for whatever purpose you have. And that's what God is asking for here. Man, there's some trigger words there, or signal words there that I said as a Christian pastor. So if you're a Christian, you heard it already. I don't have to sort of say it explicitly. But the same thing is true of us today. Everything that we are, everything that we have is because of God. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have it. And therefore we owe our entire lives to God, right? Um, so God has just saved, I mean, he's really delivered everybody, but specifically from death, he has saved every firstborn in Israel. And now he's saying, okay, now you're to consecrate them to me. You're to set them aside for my purpose. So what does that look like? Number 8 says, what does that look like? According to 13:12 through 16a, for most livestock used for food, they are to be an offering given instead to the Lord. So if they had sheep, things like that, that would be slaughtered for food, then the firstborn is dedicated to the Lord, and they would slaughter it for God, and they would not eat it, but it would be an offering to him. B, for animals that are not used for food, such as donkeys, which are, workforce, if you will, they are instead to redeem them by sacrificing another animal, a lamb in their place. To redeem is to trade one thing for another, like a ticket for a movie or a sports event. I'm going to redeem this ticket. I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to get this. In this case, the lamb, which is something maybe less valuable, is given in exchange for the life of the other animal. So I'm going to sacrifice the firstborn of every lamb, and then I'm going to sacrifice a lamb for the firstborn of every donkey, and I'm going to make a sacrifice for the firstborn of every human. So every firstborn is redeemed by this sacrifice. See, the firstborn sons were also redeemed according to verse 15. And of course, they were said to be consecrated in verse 2. D, as with any other symbols, children would ask why this was done. In this case, specifically, the sons would ask why, and they would know that it was God who saved them and they belong to God. But instead of them being sacrificed, an animal has been sacrificed in their place, and they are very literally saved again when they owe their very life to God. Now, let me just say this. Our kind of number one sacramental theology book, understanding of what the sacraments mean to the Church of the Nazarene, is a book by Rob Staples called Outward Sign, Inward Grace. And that title harkens back to something that I believe John Wesley said about the sacraments, about baptism, about the Lord's Supper. And he said it is an outward sign of an inward grace. And one of the contentions in that, let me just back up a second. So all denominations do not believe the exact same thing about the sacraments. All Christian denominations have sacraments. The Catholic Church, I believe, has 7. The Church of the Nazarene has 2. And that's just baptism and the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, communion. In the Catholic Church, ordination is a sacrament, marriage is a sacrament. There are more sacraments, but there's good argument for making more of those things sacraments, and I mean we can go down. It's not the point of this Bible study to talk about what makes something a sacrament, but they have to be instituted by Christ, and we have to find them in the Bible and things like that. And anyway, what the reason I bring all that up is because Rob Staples contends sometimes, for instance, the Catholic Church believes that the bread and the wine become the body and the blood of Jesus. Baptists, I believe it is only a symbol, or I think that's also the Anabaptists believe that it's only a symbol. And so the Church of the Nazarene finds ourselves somewhere in between, in that we believe it is an outward sign. So the outward sign is just a symbol, but God is present in the partaking of the symbol, and therefore there is an inward grace happening that cannot be seen. So I take this symbol, but God's doing something inside of me. The reason I say all that is that this sacrifice that they're making to redeem the firstborn is very much sacramental. It is, as Wesley would say, an outward sign of an inward grace. In other words, the reason that it's so moving or so powerful is that it's an outward sign of something that has already happened inward, and by God giving this outward sign, it makes the thing that has already happened very real and very personal to us. So imagine if you were that son asking your dad, why is it that we sacrifice this lamb? And he says, it's because you would have been killed. If you were alive during the days of the Passover and you were in Egypt, you would have been killed except for the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. And because God saved you, you belong to God. But I don't want to kill you to sacrifice you. So instead, I'm sacrificing this lamb in your place. And as I'm saying that, you should be hearing some words that if you're a part of the Christian church that make chills go down your spine and make you tear up a little bit, because it's the very thing that God did for us. You know, the lamb, Jesus took our place. He was sacrificed. He was the sacrificial lamb who redeemed us, who took our place so that we were not killed. Now, the redemption of the firstborn becomes a theme, and this is not the end of it, because the redemption of the firstborn happens with these lambs, but also when God chooses the Levites as the priests. There was almost a 1-to-1 ratio between the Levites who became the priests of God, dedicated to God, and the firstborn of all of Israel. And so the Levites became the redemption of Israel's firstborn as well, because otherwise all of Israel's firstborns would have become the priests, not had an inheritance of their own, and live their life to serve the rest of the people of Israel. But instead, that's who the Levites became. And so that redemption theme kind of continues on. But in this case, it's a very real representation where the child can look at this lamb who was slain and see that if it weren't for that lamb, it would be me. God has saved me, and this lamb represents that I belong to God, and this lamb is given over for my life, to pay the debt, essentially, that I owe, for the salvation that God has brought to me. Number 9, what meaning should this process have to us? So I've been talking about this, but the same meaning. We should hear this and see this, and it should move us to talk in this way about this redemption. The second part says, how have we been saved or redeemed? We also had a lamb who was slain for us, who took on our sin and who died in our place, and we belong to God. To whom do we owe our very life? To God. How will we respond and remember? So how we respond is we ought to live our life dedicated to God. How we remember, we have the Lord's Supper, which is our version of the Passover feast. But there ought to be more things that we do to try to remember and never forget what he's done for us. We should have things that cause people to ask, why do you do that? And we say, it's because I belong to him. I owe him my everything. And this is a representation of me just trying to pay the price, trying to recognize the cost that was paid for me. And I've been redeemed. And anyway, this is good stuff. I'm glad to be teaching the Bible study. I don't get to preach on this. I actually handed this off to Pastor James, but I'm very, very happy that we're studying it because it's moving to me.